Hello, and welcome back to a special episode of the Loco Files. In today's episode, we are not covering a class, but a specific engine. That being Flying Scotsman. The LNER Class A34472 Flying Scotsman is a 462 Pacific steam locomotive built in 1923 for the London and North Eastern Railway at Doncaster Works to a design of Nigel Gresley. It was employed on long-distance East Coast Mainline express trains by the LNER and its successors British Railways Eastern and North Eastern regions. Notably on London to Edinburgh Flying Scotsman train services, after which it was named. The locomotive set 2 world records for steam traction, becoming the first steam locomotive to be officially authenticated as reaching 100 miles per hour on the 30th of November 1934, and then setting a record for the longest non-stop run by a steam locomotive when it ran 422 miles on the 8th of August 1989 whilst in Australia. Retired from regular service in 1963 after covering 2 million miles, Flying Scotsman enjoyed considerable fame in preservation under the ownerships of Alan Pegler, William McAlpine, Tony Marchington, and finally the National Railway Museum, as well as hauling enthusiast specials in the United Kingdom. The locomotive has toured extensively in the United States and Canada from 1969 until 1973, and Australia in 1988 and 1989. Flying Scotsman is often described as the world's most famous steam locomotive. Flying Scotsman was completed in February 1923 at Doncaster Works as the third out of 51 Class A1 locomotives built to a design by Nigel Gresley. The A1s were designed for mainline and later express passenger services, initially on the Great Northern Railway, a constituent company of the London and North Eastern Railway, after the amalgamation of 1923, for which they became the standard design. Flying Scotsman cost £7,944 to build and initially carried the number 1472, as the GNR had not yet decided on a system-wide numbering scheme. Following amalgamation in February 1924, the locomotive acquired its name after the Flying Scotsman Express service between London King's Cross and Edinburgh Waverley, and assigned a new number, 4472. Flying Scotsman became a flagship locomotive for the LNER, representing the company at the British Empire Exhibition at Wembley Park in 1924 and 1925. In 1928, the LNER decided to make the Flying Scotsman a non-stop service for the first time. 4472 became one of 5 A1s selected for the service and hauled the inaugural run on May the 1st, where it completed the journey in 8 hours and 3 minutes. For this, the locomotive ran with an upgraded tender, which held 9 tons of coal, and fitted with a corridor connection so a change of driver and fireman could take place whilst the train was still moving. By replenishing water from water trough systems several times en route, these modifications allowed the A1s to travel the 392 miles without stopping. Flying Scotsman ran with its corridor tender until October 1936, after which it reverted to the original type. In 1938, it was paired with a streamlined non-corridor tender and ran with this type until its withdrawal in 1963. On the 30th of November 1934, Flying Scotsman became the first steam locomotive to reach the officially authenticated speed of 100 miles per hour while hauling a light test train. It earned a place in the land speed record for railed vehicles, and the publicity-conscious LNER made much of that fact. Although the Great Western Railway's 3700 class 3440 City of Truro was reported to have reached the same speed in 1904, however this was never made official. In 1928, Gresley began to modify the A1s into an improved version, the Class A3. Flying Scotsman emerged as an A3 on the 4th of January 1947. Its old 180 psi boiler was replaced with a 225 psi version with the long banjo dome of the type it carries today, and was fitted with more efficient valves and cylinders. In December 1958, it was fitted with a double Kyle-Chap chimney to improve performance and economy, but it caused soft exhaust and smoke drift that tended to obscure the driver's forward vision. The remedy was found in the German-style smoke deflectors fitted at the end of 1961. Following the success of Gresley's streamlined A4s, Flying Scotsman was no longer the LNER's flagship engine, and was relegated to lesser duties, but still worked on the main line and hauling passenger services. In 1946, the locomotive was renumbered not once but twice by Gresley's successor, Edward Thompson, who devised a comprehensive renumbering scheme for the LNER. 4472 was initially assigned the number 502 in January, but an amendment to the system led to its renumbering of 103 4 months later. Following the nationalisation of Britain's railways on the 1st of January 1948, almost all of the LNER's locomotives numbers were increased by 60,000, and 103 became 60103 that December. On the 4th of June 1950, now under British Railways ownership, Flying Scotsman was allocated to its new base at Leicester Central on the Great Central Railway, running passenger services to and from London Marylebone, Leicester, Sheffield and Manchester. It returned to the East Coast Main Line in 1953, initially based in Grantham for several months, before returning to London King's Cross in April 1954, where it remained until its withdrawal in 1963. In 1962, British Railways announced that it would scrap Flying Scotsman. Number 60103 ended service with its last scheduled run on the 14th of January 1963, with Jack Pexon of Copley Hill running the 1315 from London King's Cross to Leeds, with the locomotive coming off at Doncaster. After a previous failed attempt by the Gresley A3 Preservation Society to raise the required £3,000 to buy Flying Scotsman, businessman and railway enthusiast Alan Pegler stepped in. He first saw the locomotive at the British Empire exhibition in 1924, and received £70,000 in 1961 for his shareholding in the Northern Rubber Company, when it was sold to Pegler's Valves, a company started by his grandfather. In 1963, and after 18 months of negotiations with British Railways, Pegler bought the locomotive for £3,500, with the political support of Prime Minister Harold Wilson. He spent large amounts of money restoring the locomotive at Doncaster Works as closely as possible to its LNER condition. It was repainted into its LNER livery, the smoke deflectors were removed, The double chimney was replaced for a single chimney, and its standard tender was replaced with a corridor type that the locomotive had run with between 1928 and 1936. Pegler's contract with British Railways allowed him to run Flying Scotsman on enthusiast specials until the 31st of December 1971. For a time, it was the only steam locomotive running on the British mainline. Its first public run was from London Paddington to Rhuaben, Wales, and back on the 10th of April 1963, where over 8,000 people came to see the locomotive at Birmingham. In the following year, Pegler had the engine stand on the Forth Bridge for several days whilst sketched for a portrait by Terence Cuneo. On the 13th of November 1965, Flying Scotsman claimed the fastest steam-hauled run between London Paddington and Cardiff, working the Panda Pullman. It also set the fastest run on the return journey. By the end of 1965, Flying Scotsman had recouped the $3,500 it had cost Pegler to buy it. As watering facilities for steam locomotives were disappearing, in September 1966, Pegler spent £1,000 on a second corridor tender, which was adapted as an auxiliary water tank for a further £6,000, and coupled behind the first tender. This allowed the engine to operate with a total water capacity of around 11,000 gallons. Boiler and cylinder parts from Flying Scotsman's scrapped sister engine 60041 Salmon Trout were also purchased. In May 1968, the locomotive completed a non-stop London to Edinburgh run, marking the 40th anniversary of its inaugural run on the non-stop Flying Scotsman service, and the year steam traction officially ended on British Railways. A non-stop return journey was made 3 days later. Following an overhaul on the locomotive in the winter of 1968, Wilson's government agreed to support Pegler running Flying Scotsman in the United States and Canada to support British exports. To comply with local railway regulations, it was fitted with a cowcatcher, bell, Buckeye couplers, American-style whistle, air brakes, and high-intensity headlamp. The tour began on the 8th of October 1969, with a run from Boston, Massachusetts to Atlanta, Georgia, via New York City and Washington, D.C., and continued to Slayton, Texas during the winter. Despite starting well, the tour ran into problems, as strict anti-steam laws in some states deemed the engine a fire hazard, or required the engine to be towed by a diesel or electric locomotive. None of the trips on the tour carried paying passengers, as it was declared illegal to do so. Which, thinking about it, why didn't Pegler just say, look, I need to make money off this, so I can continue to fund my locomotive and keep her running into the future? But no, we all know what happened, unfortunately. Nonetheless, Flying Scotsman completed its journey from Texas to Wisconsin before finishing in Montreal in 1970, and from Toronto to San Francisco in 1971. A total of 15,400 miles. While in San Francisco, Flying Scotsman ran a series of passenger trips on the San Francisco Belt Railroad, and was put on show at Fisherman's Wharf. Although a commercial success at first, Pegler was £132,000 in debt by the end of 1971, and declared himself bankrupt in the following year, leaving Flying Scotsman stranded in the US. He arranged for the locomotive to be kept in storage at the US Army Sharp Depot in Lathrop, California, to keep it away from unpaid creditors. Pegler worked his passage home from San Francisco to England on a P&O cruise ship and began a new career giving lectures about trains and travel in addition to being the chairman of the Festiniog Railway. Amid fears of the engine's future, horticulturalist and steam enthusiast Alan Bloom phoned businessman William McAlpine in January 1973 in an attempt to save it. McAlpine agreed and dealt with the attorneys, paid the creditors, and bought the locomotive. Flying Scotsman was shipped back to England via the Panama Canal the following month. Upon arrival at Liverpool, the engine travelled to Derby under its own steam, with the route lined with crowds. McAlpine paid for its restoration at Derby Works and 2 subsequent overhauls in the 23 years that he owned and ran the locomotive. Trial runs took place on the Peyton and Dartmouth Steam Railway, of which McAlpine was chairman, in the summer of 1973, after which it was transferred to Steamtown in Carnforth, from where it steamed on regular tours. In December 1977, Flying Scotsman entered Vickers Engineering Works in Barrow-in-Furness for heavy repairs, including an unused replacement boiler. In 1986, McAlpine leased a former diesel locomotive maintenance shop at Southall Railway Centre, which would become the new base for Flying Scotsman until 2004. In October 1988, at the invitation of the Australian government, Flying Scotsman arrived in Australia to take part in the country's bicentenary celebrations as the central attraction of the Oz Steam 88 Festival. The event organisers had been interested in having LNER A4 number 4468 Mallard visit, but it was unavailable due to the 50th anniversary of its world record high-speed run, and 4472 was recommended as its replacement. During the course of the next year, Flying Scotsman travelled more than 28,000 miles over Australian rails, concluding with a return transcontinental run from Sydney to Perth via Alice Springs, in which it became the first steam locomotive to travel over the recently built standard gauge line to Alice Springs. Whilst in Australia, it was operated by 3801 Limited, which is now East Coast Heritage Rail, and was often seen working with locomotive 3801. Other highlights included Flying Scotsman doubleheading with New South Wales Government Railways Pacific Locomotive 3801, a triple parallel run along broad gauge Victorian Railway R-Class locomotives, and parallel runs alongside South Australia Railways locomotives 520 and 621. Its visit to Perth saw a reunion with GWR Castle class Pendennis Castle, which had been exhibited alongside Flying Scotsman at the 1924 British Empire Exhibition. On the 8th of August 1989, Flying Scotsman set another record en route to Alice Springs from Melbourne, travelling 422 miles from Parkes to Broken Hill non-stop, the longest such run by a steam locomotive ever recorded. The same journey also saw Flying Scotsman set its own haulage record, when it took a 735-tonne train over the 490-mile leg between Tarcoola and Alice Springs. Flying Scotsman returned to Britain in December 1989, where it resumed working on Heritage Railways and the main line from the following May. It returned to its former British Railways condition, with the refitting of the German-style smoke deflectors and double chimney, and was repainted into BR Brunswick green. In 1993, McAlpine sold Flying Scotsman to help pay off a mortgage on the locomotive. This resulted in music producer and railway enthusiast Pete Waterman to merge his railway interests with McAlpine's, and the two formed Flying Scotsman Railways, with Waterman running the business side of the partnership. In April 1995, while working on the Llangollen Railway in Wales, Flying Scotsman derailed during an empty stock movement, with all wheels coming off the track before coming to a halt. When placed back on the rails and put back into steam, smoke emerged from a crack separating the boiler and the front cab. It was deemed a total failure and immediately withdrawn from service. In June, the locomotive returned to Southall, awaiting its next major overhaul. By 1996, McAlpine and Waterman had run into financial issues, and to help pay off an overdraft, McAlpine decided to put Flying Scotsman on sale again. On the 23rd of February, entrepreneur Tony Marchington, already well known in the steam preservation movement, bought the locomotive and a set of coaches for £1.5 million. He spent a further £1 million on the locomotive's subsequent overhaul to mainline condition, which lasted 3 years, and at that point was the most extensive in the locomotive's history. Its first run following the works took place on the 4th of July 1999, hauling the inaugural Scotsman from London King's Cross to York. It also hauled several Venice Simplon Orient Express Pullman trains. Marchington's time with the Flying Scotsman was the subject of the Channel 4 documentary A Steamy Affair, the story of Flying Scotsman. In 2002, Marchington proposed a business plan, which included the construction of a Flying Scotsman village in Edinburgh, to create revenue from associated branding. In 2003, Edinburgh City Council turned down the village plans, and in September 2003, Marchington was declared bankrupt. Flying Scotsman plc CEO Peter Butler announced losses of £474,619, and with a £1.5 million overdraft at Barclays Bank, stated the company only had enough cash to trade until April 2004. Later, the company's shares were suspended after it had failed to declare interim results. In February 2004, a debt agency acting on behalf of Flying Scotsman plc announced it would be holding a sealed bid auction for the locomotive, to be held on the 2nd of April. Amid fears it could be sold into foreign hands, the National Railway Museum in York announced it would bid and appealed for funds. It secured a winning bid of £2.3 million, 15% higher than the second highest bid. The bulk of the money came from a £1.8 million grant from the National Heritage Memorial Fund, with the remainder coming from £350,000 raised from public donations, which was matched by businessman Richard Branson, and £70,000 raised by the Yorkshire Post newspaper. Included in the sale was a spare boiler from 1944 that Flying Scotsman carried from 1965 to 1978, spare cylinders, and a Mark I support coach. The locomotive arrived in York in time to be exhibited as part of the museum's Railfest in June 2004 to celebrate 200 years of rail travel. In 2004 and 2005, Flying Scotsman intermittently hauled special trains across Great Britain, although problems with its condition soon became apparent. It failed on the delivery trip to Railfest and several times afterwards in the following months, but the museum's engineering staff unfortunately failed to spot critical faults. From September 2004 until May 2005, it sat at the NRM's workshop for heavy intermediate repairs. The intention being to improve reliability and allow operation until its general restoration and overhaul. However, by the end of 2005, the intermediate repairs failed to improve the situation and the NRM decided to proceed with the general overhaul. The locomotive entered the NRM's workshop in January 2006 with the original intention to return it to Gresley's original specifications and renew its boiler certificate. It was estimated that this work would take 1 year to complete and cost around £750,000. If only they knew. Anyway, the works were on view for visitors at the NRM, but the engine was dismantled rapidly to such an extent that the running plate was the only component recognisable to the casual observer. In July 2007, the museum pushed back the expected completion date by 18 months, due in part to issues with the boiler's restoration. By 2009, with further problems encountered including misaligned frames and a cracked cylinder, plus rising metal prices, the museum launched the SOS or Save Our Scotsman appeal, seeking to raise a further £250,000, with the aim of completing the work by the end of the year. In May 2011, Flying Scotsman was unveiled on the museum's turntable, finished in wartime black LNER livery. After final tests, it was to be painted LNER apple green and have it running excursions by the summer. However, cracks were discovered in the horn blocks and further testing revealed more cracks throughout the frame assembly, leading to the replacement of the main stretcher bar, horn ties, and middle cylinder motion bracket, all of which were deemed beyond repair. In 2012, with the project still unfinished, the museum published a report examining the reasons for the delay and additional costs. It found that the museum had greatly underestimated the work required due to the poor condition of the locomotive, much of which had been missed by a rushed inspection, which produced an overly optimistic assessment which was not based on engineering realities. It was also found that once the project was underway, management lacked the experience, continuity, or resources to undertake such a complex task, which was also hampered by illness and recruitment issues. Although the museum had a formal contract system to manage suppliers, managers failed to implement it properly. Problems were also caused by the conflicting objectives of producing a certified mainline locomotive while retaining as many original components and assembly as possible, and between the need to overhaul the locomotive and use it as a marketing tool for the museum. The report recommended that the NRM consider the scope, size and responsibilities of their project management and engineering functions, and their contracting policy. Following the report, the NRM commissioned first-class partnerships to independently review the remaining work identified as necessary by the NRM and make recommendations on how to proceed. In March 2013, the museum announced that FCP had determined the locomotive would not return to the main line until 2015, and believed the outstanding work should be put out to external tender. Riley & Son was announced as the winning contractor, and on the same day the locomotive was moved to their workshop in order to return it to running condition no earlier than the summer of 2015. In April 2015, the boiler left the NRM to be reunited with the rest of the locomotive. 3 months later, as the restoration neared completion, it was estimated to have the locomotive back in service by early 2016, with new electronic equipment needed to operate on the main line. The final cost of the restoration amounted to £4.5 million, having risen by a £300,000 estimate in the summer of 2015 due to the further necessary works and the need to meet the deadline for the return to service. On the 8th of January 2016, Flying Scotsman moved under its own steam for the first time since 2005. Following tests on the East Lancashire Railway, its inaugural mainline run was cancelled due to faulty brakes. It was rescheduled for the 6th of February, hauling the Winter Cumbrian Mountain Express from Carnforth to Carlisle, still wearing its 2011 wartime black livery, with the number 60103 on the smokebox, and its LNER wartime numbers 103 and 502 on the cab sides. After it was repainted into BR Brunswick Green, Flying Scotsman returned to London King's Cross on the 25th of February with a run to York. Thousands of people lined the route, and the train was forced to stop due to members of the public trespassing on the line near St Neots. Totally wasn't foreshadowing there. Flying Scotsman has run on British heritage and mainline railways since its return in 2016. In October 2018, 6 years after Pegler's death, it hauled the Farewell Alan Pegler special from King's Cross to York, organised at the request of his daughter. In his will, Pegler requested for half of his ashes to be placed in the firebox of the locomotive as it ascended Stoke Bank. The climb was accompanied by a long blast of the whistle as passengers on board gave a moment of silence. In January 2019, Flying Scotsman hauled the non-stop Scotsman's Salute from King's Cross to York, this time as a tribute to McAlpine following his death in March 2018. In April 2022, the engine was withdrawn for an overhaul in preparation for its centenary year in 2023. Following the work, it will be certified to run on the main line until 2029. That's kind of scary. After which it will run solely on the Heritage Railways until 2032. Its first engagement following restoration was to be a summer visit to the Bluebell Railway, but it was postponed and rescheduled for 2023 after a broken piston ring was discovered to have damaged a cylinder. It appeared at London King's Cross as a static display for 2 days to commemorate the 170th anniversary of the station's opening on the 14th and 15th of October 2022, followed by a return to steam for a visit to the Swanage Railway. I'd like to thank you for watching and listening. If you liked it, feel free to hit the like button, feel free to drop a comment, whether it's your opinion about Scotsman, whether you've been behind Scotsman, whether your grandfather drove Flying Scotsman. I have a feeling we'll get a few of those. And should Flying Scotsman be the sole survivor of the Grizzly A1/A freeze? Let me know in the comments down below, and also if I sound a little different throughout this recording. COVID is still kind of screwing with my chest. And yes, this has taken a lot longer to record than normal. But don't worry, I'm not going to let it stop me. It has changed plans for episodes slightly. Which you'll have seen by now anyway. And yeah, let me know if you'd like me to just focus on maybe one member of a class if it's the sole survivor, or if I should just cover the whole class regardless, which was the original plan for this episode, because I don't wish to rip off my inspiration, Chris and Eden Green. Yeah, thank you, and goodbye.